Hi guys, welcome back to the Right Brain podcast. I have one of my favorite people here, Mr. Danny Myrick. He is an absolute legend. He's written countless number ones, which I was very reminded of last night when we played at the Bluebird and I had to follow all of his songs that everyone has known and singing along to. And I was like, oh, okay, she's country. Yeah, cool. I'll just go after that. But no, Danny is one of my mentors and favorite songwriters. And yeah, I feel very grateful to have him in my life and have him on the podcast today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I feel very honored.
Yeah, we just played at the Bluebird last night, and it was my first time playing there, his 7 millionth time.
It was, yeah, I don't know how many times. It's been a bunch. But I will tell you, the first time I ever played it, I played my good friend, Jeffrey Steele, who's a Hall of Fame songwriter. It was him and I was writing for him. He was my publisher at the time. And he's like, have you ever played the Bluebird? I'm like, no. Oh, man, you got to play it. Let's book a show. And, you know, of course, I'm very naively and innocently, like you were when we thought, oh, I would love to play it. I would love to play it. Well, so it was him and a guy named Anthony Smith. We have a black Anthony and a white Anthony here in town. It's white Anthony Smith. And then Bob DePiro. Anyway, these guys were all on a roll of a lifetime at the time. Like they all just were crushing it on the radio. I had no hits. And so I went through, it was 10 times worse than whatever you thought you felt last night. I was like, I was the only guy in the round, didn't have any hits, and was so incredibly intimidated. And it would be like three, massive hit songs. And then I would play some new thing nobody's ever heard. And I, shaking, scared to death. And
that was exactly what I was last night. I couldn't stop every time I went to take a sip of my beer, I was like,
you were awesome. You did a great job.
Thanks.
Very, very exciting first Bluebird experience for you.
It was very fun.
Crushed it. It's good. I'm proud of you.
Thank you. My dad was there too. Yeah, and then my parents went back to their hotel room and they were like, did you know that Danny's in the magazine at the hotel? So my dad has it here. But yeah.
Good time.
There's an article about him in here.
Yeah, there's an article in here about, and I thought this is a great subject for what we'll talk about. And I want to get to this, but I'm really more interested in learning more of your history and, again, your origin story as to how you got into music, how you became a songwriter, where you're from,
cool.
Your background. You were giving us a little bit of discussion of your family background. And
yeah, I was kind of born into it. I grew up in a little Mississippi town on the coast called Pascagoula, which is Jimmy Buffett's birthplace. That's probably what it's best known for. Huh. But my mom and dad were from rural Mississippi, up about 2.5 hours north of that, Jones County, Laurel, Mississippi, So Mississippi. If anyone's ever heard of Free State of Jones, a movie that Matthew McConaughey did, that's about the county I grew up in. But my dad was a young preacher. He and my mom got married when he was 19 and she was 16. And he was a preacher down there, and my mom played piano. And so at the time that me and my brothers came along, we had a little family band. So we never had really any choice. It was like, church services, and me and my brother were sitting on each side of her playing piano during the church services that my dad would preach. So we dove into the music thing really, really early, started this family band, did our first album when I was 7. And so by the time I graduated high school, we had made 6 albums. And
this is your family?
It's my family. It's my mom playing piano, me and my older brother, who's 1 year older, singing, until 10 years later my younger brother came along. But yeah, it was this really and a lot of people in Nashville get it, but this real sort of subculture of music that's Southern gospel music, quartet music. Older listeners who might remember, Elvis used to tour with a quartet called the Stamps, and then another quartet called the Jordanaires. That's sort of the music I grew up in. And 4-part harmony, gospel quartet kind of thing. And so my dad, in addition to pastoring a church, also promoted gospel concerts in our little town. We had a civic center down there that probably seated 2,000 people. So he would promote these concerts, and when these artists would come to town, we would open the show. And so, did that my whole upbringing. I started writing songs maybe about age 14, 15. And it worked out great for me because we would open the show and we would do these songs that were originals. And the first cut I ever got was I was 16, 17, and we opened for this group. They heard this one song, came up to me after and said, "Hey, would you mind if we record this song?" And I didn't even know how it worked. So I'm like, "Yeah, sure." So they record the song. They send me a single song agreement for a publishing thing. They put it out. It's #1 for 3 months.
Wow.
And, I get my first BMI check right after I turned 18. And it's like $3,500. And I'm like, wait, what is this? And so, so that was sort of the eye opener to me that maybe I could make a living actually writing songs. And so, but it all started with the gospel thing. And I moved to town, went to Belmont for a little under a year. But my first day at school, the first person that I met there was a Christian artist named Stephen Curtis Chapman, and who has gone on to, he's probably the most awarded Dove Award, which is the gospel version of the Grammys, and he's won a ton of Grammys. He's the first person I met there, and we both had cuts on this same record and kind of hit it off. And so anyway, I went on to I had 7 #1 songs as a gospel songwriter.
Wow.
But really loved country music, so I started a band in the 90s called Western Flyer, and kind of an Eagles style, 6 guys all sang tight harmonies, and got a record deal with that band. And through that process ended up meeting Jeffrey Steele, who I mentioned earlier. And he was really kind of a mentor to me getting going as a songwriter. And I jumped way ahead in the years, but that's kind of how it all started.
That's great. And the first major hit you had or cut that you had that was on a country, what was that?
The first major hit I had was a song called International Harvester.
Oh yeah,
and
sure.
I loved when you played that last night.
Craig Morgan did it, and it was really, really odd song. It was the structure of it was really strange, and I wrote it with Jeffrey Steele and Shane Miner, and we were just like, man, nobody's ever going to cut this song. Jeffrey's demo of it was really weird. It didn't feel like it had a chorus. It was just really odd. But there was a new label in town called Broken Bow Records that had Craig Morgan and Jason Aldean. And Craig was really doing well on the radio. And this lady at the label named Tina Crawford just fell in love with the song. She would not let it die. She was really, really understanding of the farming community. She's like, man, this is like, and so she just kept hammered over their head. They finally recorded the song. And she was in radio promotion. She's like, it's got to be a single. It's got to go to radio, whatever. So she fought for it. And I actually, the first pub deal that I ever got dropped from, I lost my pub deal in December before International Harvester came out in February. And so I got a little taste of what it feels like to sort of be fired from a pub deal. And then, 6 months later, have a song going up the charts. And that was my first one. So
that's big. That's obviously big, and you played that last night. That was
it's fun.
Pretty awesome to hear that. Yeah.
So like, what made you? I know you said like obviously you were making albums and songs with your family, but like, what drove you to like want to start writing songs?
Well, I think at that point there was sort of a combination of in like the gospel hymn world that I grew up in. There was a combination of these gospel groups who would do like all these old standard hymns that you would hear in a Baptist hymnal, 4-part harmony. They were really, really good. At the same time in the 70s, there were 3 or 4 bands that like it would be like the Oak Ridge Boys, who ended up becoming a huge gospel or country group. They started off, like if you look at early pictures of them, they look like the 4 guys who sang behind Elvis Presley, super clean cut, whatever. Fast forward to the years that I was like 10, 11, 12, 13, they had grown their hair out. They had a full band, bass, drums, electric guitar, steel guitar, piano. And so I started getting exposed to these country bands. There was a band called the Hensons, the Happy Goodman family. They had great bands. Matter of fact, the Oak Ridge Boys band leader at the time was a piano player named Tony Brown, who ended up running MCA Records and possibly, arguably, the biggest producer in the history of country music. So that level of players. So I suddenly started seeing all these great players that were playing on all these country records and all this stuff. And they all wrote their own songs. And so, the Hensons, for example, they had singles on the radio in the gospel world that they were theologically what I grew up with in the Christian church, but they had hooks. Like the Hensons had a song called "Call Me Gone," and it's like, call me a dreamer because I call it mine heaven. I don't care. Call me crazy. Call me whatever. But when Jesus calls my name, you can call me gone. Like, and it's like a country hook. Like, if I said you had a beautiful body, would you hold it against me? It's like, wow, they like are doing these hooks. So that made me want to try to create the same sort of vibe. And I was, of course, at that point, I tell my kids all the time, 70s FM radio was the time to be alive musically. Everything was on there. And so me and my brother, in the super conservative world we lived in, were sneaking rock records and listening to FM radio at night. And so I wanted to try to get a little piece of that into our little family band music. So we're constantly pushing the limits there. So that was it. Like about 14, 15, I wrote this song called Jesus is the Light, that it's like they say, write what you know. That's all that I knew. It's a super, super simple song, but it sounded like an Eagles Lion Eyes kind of thing. And there were several of these quartets that, we were talking earlier about the band Alabama. Alabama had blown up on the radio. And country music and some of these gospel groups wanted to do that sort of sound. So they started this new genre called Christian country. And it just worked perfectly for me. They did this song, it went to number one. So I started having these back-to-back number ones of these gospel songs that sounded like the Eagles, And so that's kind of what got it started. And I didn't know at the time I could make any money doing it, and compared to country, it's so small. But you're, 17, 18 years old in the 80s in Mississippi and getting, 4-figure checks. And it's like, man, this is amazing,
Yes.
To be delivering pizzas.
Last night you alluded to something about, and as you're talking about it, my automatic instinct is that, you're sneaking away to listen to rock music, and a lot of that was kind of obviously not anti-Christian, but obviously not
it was very anti-Christian
right.
in my house.
And so you also alluded to a point where like your songwriting maybe conflicted a little bit with your family background and your religious background. And how did that happen? How did you deal with that? And
that was complicated. I mean, my, there are various worlds. We talk a lot about Catholic guilt and, just anybody who grew up in a pretty intense religious background. My particular sect that we grew up in was the Missionary Baptist Church that was incredibly conservative. We would go to church camps when I was a teenager, and guys and girls couldn't swim together. Because you might lust like you otherwise wouldn't any other time. But anyway, we listened to only Christian music. It was, just very, very conservative. And so, and it wasn't just music. It was like anything, any of the things that, going through puberty, any of the things that you experience as a teenager, it's all very sinful. And the amount of shame and guilt that came with that was pretty intense. And so, by the time I was graduating high school, I loved music. I won our high school talent contest singing a gospel song, which was not super popular, but, big fish, small town. I was pretty good at what I did. And, but my biggest decision was, everything went through the filter of what is God calling you to do. So I didn't really feel a whole lot of freedom to be like, what I seem to be gifted at is writing songs, making hooks work. I'm going to go write what I want. Everything was about, man, what is God calling you to do? So I was like, do I need to go to seminary? Am I supposed to be a pastor? Am I, Christian music? And if you're going to do music, it's got to be Christian music. And, it was even pushing the limits a little bit if I wanted to do like contemporary Christian music, like Amy Grant and Michael W. Smith, these people that had blown up. That was even in my household pretty out there. But I came to Nashville, did the Christian music thing for a little while, had a few more hit songs and like contemporary Christian music. And then I just loved country music. And my grandfather, who was really probably my first major music influence outside of my mom, was a big Hank Williams fan. And he lived in super rural Mississippi, little town called Soso. And so after the 5 o'clock news would go off, he would get his guitar, which he called a flat top guitar, and he sang a lot like Hank Williams, like super sort of high lonesome bluegrass gospel. We would listen to the Grand Ole Opry, and that really is what ignited my love for country music. And so I dove into that, and yeah, I mean, my family, once I got a record deal, and then I'm on the radio, and the radio stations in Mississippi played us a lot because we were from there, and it was a real powerful glimpse into the hypocrisy of all of it, to where conversations with my dad about I'm writing country music, not gospel music, and it's like, man, I wish you would get back to doing what God called you to do, kind of thing, and this sort of guilt. Then suddenly I have a song that's like number 5 on the radio station in Jackson, Mississippi, and we're doing our radio tour, and we show up at the radio station, and the first one there is my dad. And of course, he's talking to the radio guy. Yeah, my son's the lead singer. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, you're enjoying the spotlight, but that whole thing. And so, yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that I just had to sort of decide, I had a lot of empathy and sympathy for my dad with, all you know is all you know. He grew up in a really, really rural, small worldview environment. And once I came to Nashville, it was just sort of like, man, I just can't live my life for the sake of pleasing my parents or whatever. That was a lot more complicated on the God thing, because everything I did filter through, am I disappointing God, with whatever. But, I just had to, I had to move on. It's what I did. It's what I love doing. So I just had to kind of move on from it. And it's been a whole lifelong process moving through the theology of that. That's way beyond the music side of it. But
well, we talk about, obviously the right brain, this is part of it, and bringing this to neuroscience, that, the right brain is all about attachment, trying to connect with other people. And the language really of the right brain is more music, but that it also, is about shame and guilt and embarrassment and ultimately fear of rejection. Because that's kind of what embarrassment and shame and guilt are. Yeah. And that the people that are most gifted in the writing world and in the music writing are really very right brain dominant people. And so therefore you're also more vulnerable to feel that shame and embarrassment and guilt even more. So it's interesting because you grew up in a background where obviously you're from a musical family, and we say that a lot of that, whether you're right brain or left brain dominant, is built on a trait. It's a family trait. It runs in families. And so if you have people that say a musical family, and it sounds like you grew up with that.
For sure.
But then at the same token, then you also grew up with an environment that is going to maximize those feelings of guilt and shame and really weaponize them. And really weaponize them against you, right?
100%.
But then so you're tapping into your gift by writing, but also there's that border that if you write the wrong thing, that shame and guilt, that must have been really difficult for you.
It's very complicated because, I say this all the time. This is such a dysfunctional thing to teach a kid. I remember, there's just different levels of sort of, I hate to use the word liberalism, like within the church thing, because that feels so theological. Just styles of worship, styles of preaching, styles of music. So my grandparents' church in Soso, Mississippi, was very, very old school music, hellfire damnation kind of preaching. That very, very dramatic, like you might see if you've ever seen the movie The Apostle, with Robert Duvall. It's that sort of vibe. So my dad came out of that. Well, we moved to the coast, and our church, we were a little bit more influenced by Pentecostal stuff, and we had the family band. So it was like raising hands and shouting and whatever, and our services were a lot more musical and whatever. And then Southern Baptists were a little bit more high church, more behaved, quiet. You wouldn't really hear a lot of shouting hallelujah or amen in those services, whatever. Anyway, the process of all that was just, where I was going with that is I remember going to my grandparents' house as a kid. One of the big songs they sang out of this old hymn book, the words are like, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angel beckons me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. So it's all about the next life. Have you made the decision that Jesus is your savior because that's heaven or hell? It's all about after this life. And it sort of ignores your 60, 70, 80, 90 years that you have here. And I just remember, by the time I was in high school, I would go back, to their church. We would sing that song, and I'm going like, well, I mean, I feel kind of at home here. I want to be happy while I'm here. I want to figure out life here and have relationships here. And so the complication of what you're talking about with the creative mind, and living in a world that sort of squashes that, is everything was about pleasing God and servicing, that spiritual thing. And so it was very complicated with the teaching of anything that pleases you or feels good, it's like you're servicing the flesh, not the spirit. You're worshiping your feelings, whatever, not, God's calling. And so, it was really complicated, and trying to fit music that you feel like sounds good with a good melody or whatever, making sure the lyrics adhere to what you theologically are taught to believe.
Those are kind of like opposing ideas, because you're like
Definitely.
trying to be creative and write what's coming to you as like just a unique person, but you have to actually completely go by guidelines that.
And what's funny is as I got older, I began to realize, first of all, if you're willing to get on stage and share whatever, whether you're a preacher, comedian, singer, whatever, there's some ego there. You love being in the spotlight. We all know what that feels like. You're singing something, you feel the crowd responding to it. And so as I, got older, I was like, with these preachers, like, dude, I'm no more craving the spotlight than you are. The style that you preach, are you kidding me? When the crowd's getting into it, when they're not, like, and anyway. But it was conflicting, and man, it took me. I mean, I'm still in the process. Obviously, I turned 60 this year. I'm still in the process, but man, it has been a lifelong, complicated journey.
Yeah.
To lay that stuff aside.
Yeah.
And still, my mom, who I'm so close to, but we, that's a complicated conversation to have. She can't really, go that direction so much.
So is that how you dealt with it? Is there anything that you can, relate to other people, or, because you obviously made it as a big success in this field, writing about human emotions and feelings, and probably, some songs might refer to lust or things that you were told were, evil when you were younger, and you navigated that, and, being able to look back,
Well, man, I had a real anchor experience that I won't get too deep into, but after my band, we lost our record deal. I lost my pub deal. I was kind of at a restart with a young son, my previous marriage. And I kind of went back to the only world that I knew at the time, which was the church world. So I had this country band, and we had a little success, and then, lost that, as so often happens. So I went back into the church world. I ended up being on staff at a church as a youth pastor and a youth music guy, whatever. Anyway, after all of this time being on the road in a country band, whatever, I went through this fall from grace and went through just a dark time in my life while I was on staff at this church. And for the first time in my life, I was kind of on the outside looking in. I felt unwelcome in the church, incredibly judged, and went through this period of time where there was a lot of anger with that. But I think what it did for me is it gave me a moment. I had this really, really perfect life. Like I got drunk for the first time in my 30s. Like I was just such a straight arrow. And then after going through this time with this church and leaving that and stepping outside of it for a little bit, I think the good part of that is it allowed me to stop living for other people. And my entire life before, you mentioned it earlier, like the need for acceptance. I was a middle child, and it was like,
me too.
Probably being accepted was more important than anything to me. And so I suddenly found myself, I had failed miserably, and I just was the subject of ridicule and judgment and all this, embarrassed my family, just going through all this stuff in my life. And as horrible as it was to feel like I'm sort of on the bottom and going, man, I have nothing positive to offer. You know, I dealt with suicidal thoughts for the first time, just all this darkness. And, but coming out of that, it's like, who gives a shit about pleasing everybody at this point? Like, I've already messed up now. And then it was a complete restart with my theology, seeing God in a completely different way, and kind of letting go, including my family, and just saying, man, and my family, they're going to have to fall in love with me for who I am or not. And if I have to move on from them, we all have chosen family and we work through it, whatever. And, I know that's oversimplified, but that's sort of the mindset that I got into, that I'm like, I just can't live for pleasing other people. And I 100% still struggle with that, but it's just, I have to kind of daily, I mean, we deal with it with like, you know, are my songs good enough? You know, I didn't make this record. I pitched a song for the new Whoever record, and, you know, mine didn't get chosen. My friends, we live in a social media world. Believe me, every new record that comes out, I see every friend of mine who got a cut on the record when I didn't. And it's just like, you know, you want to throw your phone. But yeah, I guess the starting point of the simplicity of that is just, I can't live through other people's view of my.
What you're describing is a classic hero's journey, right? I mean, I like to work with people. I think, you know, I coach people sometimes, and one of the things we do is where, you know, people want to tell their story. They want to tell their story of their life, and you can take almost anybody's story and put it into that classic hero's journey where there's a calling, and then there's the pit moment where there's the fall from grace, where, you know, in any classic movie, you know, it's where the hero's defeated and it looks like they're out and there's no coming back. And then all of a sudden they find it leads to a search, it leads to a quest.
That's right.
And then that quest leads to certain truths that ultimately leads to a transformation where they become who they were meant to be, right?
100%.
And that's exactly what you're describing.
Exactly
and
right.
you described that perfectly as that story, you know, and it's always inspirational.
Well, I think it was funny. I think I always felt I was writing country songs about, you know, bars and cheating and breakups and, you know, whiskey and whatever, and I wasn't a drinker. I hadn't gone through I didn't live, and I mean, our band, we all met in church. It's a bunch of Christian guys. There were articles written about us that like, these were like Christian guys doing country music, whatever, which is fine. But ultimately, I had a real crisis as a songwriter, going like, man, I'm writing all this stuff that I haven't lived.
Yeah, it's not authentic. And I think it's not authentic. Yeah,
it's not authentic. And I think subliminally, there was a little bit in my life that, like, man, I need to go experience some of these things.
Well, it's like Springsteen didn't even have a driver's license when he wrote most of his albums about, you know, driving cars and things like that. He didn't even have a driver's license. But so is your dad still with us?
No, my dad passed in April of 2020. And not of COVID. But
how was your relationship?
My relationship with my dad was really complicated. Because he ended up, he went through a situation. My mom, the weekend that my younger brother moved to college, my younger brother's 10 years younger than me, my mom called to tell us that she was moving out. And they, of course, were shocked, like, wait, what? And she had found out that my dad had some sort of relationship with this young man. And of course, we were in the world that we grew up in, there's nothing that you could have said that would have been more shocking.
Yeah.
That led to a period of time as she moved out, and she didn't divorce him immediately. She just moved out. Like, she had to figure it out. But he, in the world he grew up in, he just navigated that the best he could, which was very poorly. He ended up trying drugs for the first time, ended up with a pretty intense crack addiction, of all things.
Wow.
And that just, that started him on this years long trying to get clean situation. He moved up here for a little bit. He lived in Mississippi. We moved up here for a little bit. My younger brother and I both lived in Nashville. And so, man, we went through just bouts of, trying to find sobriety for him, rehab stints that didn't work. And, the hard rock bottom that you can get to with all of that, where suddenly you got this role where, you know, I'm playing parent to him, where I've got young kids, and, you know, he's, you know, begging me for $5 or whatever. I just need to go. And I'm like, I will not give you any more money. I'll come pick you up to take you to rehab. And I won't. So we went through years of that. And he was never really a sharer. Like, one of the things I always really wanted to have with him is, you know, I wanted to be able to have some conversations with him to try to get to the reality of where he was. Cause he just never shared. He was just never vulnerable. It just wasn't the world he grew up in. And so I'd always hoped that I would have a time with him where we could, you know, I could kind of break down those walls. And, you know, all of these years when my boys were growing up, that's where my focus was. Like, man, I don't have time. And I told him at one point, dealing with this, like, you had your years to be close to me. You weren't close to me because your ministry was more important than anything else, whatever. Now is my time with my kids. I can't sacrifice that to try to make up for that with you. You know, it's sort of on you. And so by the end of his life, he ended up, you know, we had some health issues. He finally got clean, which was great. But he lived in a assisted living facility in Mississippi the last few years of his life, and, you know, mentally sort of went downhill a little bit. And then by the time he passed, you know, we had one pretty cool conversation. My wife, Megan, now my wife,
Another great songwriter.
yeah, who's awesome. And but really the year before we got married, or no, the year we got married, we had gone down for Thanksgiving, and he was in this assisted living facility, and we stopped by for a little bit, and she kind of got into a conversation with him, and he just, you know, she's a pretty young girl, and he gets in this conversation. She just kind of pulls all this stuff out of him, and I'm sort of really more just kind of sitting and interjecting here and there, but he just was talking more than he frequently had. And I remember leaving there, we got in the car, she goes, "Your dad's gay." And I'm like, "Wait, what?" You know, like, you know, it's not something we had talked about other than that previous experience. And but you know, there was a little insight in that conversation that I felt from him. But no, I wish we could have, you know, I would love to have had an opportunity when he was in a little more sound mind to just talk about his struggles and just what it must have been like for him, the guilt and shame that he would have felt in rural South Mississippi in a very conservative Christian family to try to navigate what his life was. But
well, that's what we were just talking about, like attachment disorders. And it's just so interesting because all of the things that he probably made you feel guilt and shame for were probably a lot of the things that he was made to feel guilt and shame for his whole life. So he was probably a lot more similar to you, but that was probably very confusing for you because you were being told that, like, that everything that you were doing was wrong, like him not liking that you were writing country music or all those things. Maybe those are the things that he actually wishes he had the bravery to kind
there's
of
no telling what all, like, and I've had some great conversations with my mom about it. I'm actually working on a screenplay. I'm probably going to write a book first, but just a little snippet of this whole process. I found out that, so my dad went to this little, like, tiny little Baptist college in Laurel, Mississippi years ago, and they had this weekend revival service. And in that world that we grew up in, it's like you'll have a guest preacher come in and preach these revival, you know, it's like a 4 or 5 night thing, and, you know, a lot of emotion, like Holy Spirit moving emotion in the thing. And these decisions are made. And one of the decisions, like, if God's calling you into some sort of life of ministry, they call it surrendering to preach. And so anyway, these 8 young men all around my dad's age surrendered to preach over the course of this revival one weekend in Laurel, Mississippi. Over the next 20 years, 6 of those 8 guys ended up coming out as gay men. 4 of those 6 ended up committing suicide. Wow. And so, and I just found this out, like, really right before he passed away. Wow. And so, so yeah, I'm kind of fascinated with that whole thing, and I've started writing about it a little bit and got an outline of a script. But yeah, I mean, there's you see that a lot with some of these you know, TV preachers, those really conservative preachers, that usually the thing that they're railing against the most are the things that they probably privately struggle with.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, which we see happen so often.
So did any of this, would you say, made it into any of your songs or your music or your hits? And which ones?
Not the hits. Matter of fact, it's interesting you talked about putting some of this stuff in music. I mean, I have always had the hardest time doing that. Like, I don't have any problem conversationally talking about any of it. Trying to figure out a way to get it into music. I've started doing that a lot more recently, and I'm working on a record now. I made a record in 2020, a solo record that was kind of influenced by that world that I grew up in. But I've been working on some new stuff. I'll probably make a record this year that's just a lot more autobiographical with all of that stuff. But no, my hit songs, my radio songs have typically been just conceptual songs about things, like the International Harvester's a tractor thing that became a conversation, and their She's Country was a conversation with my co-writer, that she came in with an idea as a female about these kind of songs, and I certainly write a bunch of those songs where I put pieces of life in for sure. They just for some reason haven't landed on the radio, so it's all right.
These like all of the self-work that you've done, which he's been like a huge mentor to me, even talk about like the people pleasing thing, because obviously us as right brain people, like I'm always coming to you for like reassurance, and you're like, who cares what anyone thinks, do this. So it's really great. But is that why you started working with the soldiers that you've been working with?
The soldiers thing it's wild. I've got a really good friend named Jay Clementi, who's the music director of an organization called Songwriting with Soldiers.
That's what the article
yeah, I
is.
was going to say the
that
article
showed, on this.
Nashville Lifestyles was so kind to do this article.
It's amazing. It's really, because I'm thinking of all this. Now I have the context, because I read this article, and now I have the context of how you can carry all of that stuff that you've dealt with and now bring it to trauma and trauma work and post-traumatic stress. It's really amazing stuff that you're doing.
Well, it's the organization's incredible. My buddy Jay was in a band called the Lucky Bucks on Warner Brothers years ago. He's best friends with Luke Bryan, writes with Luke a lot, and he's just country songwriter friend of mine, just a great dude. And over the years we've known each other. We'll have beers, we'll talk, we'll write, we'll catch up, whatever. And he knows me really, really well. And so coming out of 2020, in the middle of the lockdown, all the social justice stuff that we endured that summer, I was carefully posting things that I was hoping would be maybe a little bit of a, just a little movement toward healing here and there. Being a middle child, I've always sort of been a centrist, and I have my beliefs on whatever politically, but I've always kind of been like, there's got to be some way that these things can exist.
Right.
So I started posting these things, and he called me one day and said, "Hey, I do this thing called Songwriting with Soldiers. I think you would be really good if you want to try this." And I'm like, "Dude, I have great admiration for those who serve. I don't have any of that in my family. Like, you don't need any background, like whatever." So I went and I did the first retreat with them, and it really just blew me away. And we basically go in with veterans and first responders who are deep in, PTSD and other form of traumatic struggles, and just write a song with them. And really what it's all about is just listening, empathizing, helping them put their words into rhymes and melodies. And so I started doing it. And in addition to these retreats, they have a thing called Warrior Path. I was telling you guys about earlier that we just go in like overnight. We do dinner and write. I have 2 hours to write with like 7 to 9 people. It's the most intense, really, I don't know anything about them. They're on night 5 of the 6-day thing. So I sort of go in and go, okay, y'all all know each other. You've got nicknames for each other. You're talking shit about each other. Y'all are having fun. I don't know anything about you. Give me a short little who you are, what your background is, where you serve, how you ended up here. And so given 2 hours, I mean, that usually probably takes 30 minutes to go around the room and do that. And I'm trying to make notes and come up with some sort of universal thing to write about. I have no idea when I go in what we're going to write about musically, whatever. So ultimately, we end up with about 75 to 90 minutes to write a song.
And is it one song about with all
One
the people?
Song. Well,
So
the retreats are one-on-one. The retreats are 3 days that each of us will get a one-on-one with someone in a little more time. That's a little easier.
So they each come out with their own song.
Yes, they each come out with their own song.
Wow.
Over the course of a weekend, we will write, we might write 10 songs among 3 different songwriters with all the people there. And then the overnight thing, I'm writing one song with all of those people. And then, and that's tough too, because, collaboration is very, very important.
Yeah,
getting consensus with everyone, making sure that story. But ultimately, pertaining to our conversation here and with my background, I think I learned over the last, particularly 25, 30 years of my life, just a real sense of empathy after going through a period of time of feeling super outcast and not belonging in the world that I was in. I gravitated to the world I belong in and my people and my crew. I went through a divorce years later, and it was really fascinating. My ex-wife, who was awesome, she's great. We were friends from elementary school on, and she passed away in 2018. That's a whole nother conversation. But how we sort of, as you divvy up your stuff, we sort of divvied up friend groups. I was like, that's your crew, man. That's your people. And all the weirdo songwriter folks, these are my friends. This is my crew, and but I think that's helped tremendously going into these soldier things, the empathy and
again, from a neuroscience perspective, first of all, trauma lives mostly in the right brain, right? So, right. And whenever there's a blockage, and what we have when people go through trauma of any kind, and people that are more right brain dominant are more susceptible to trauma because they're more emotional,
right,
and more connected to that, and again, feel shame and guilt and embarrassment, which I'd venture to say that if you probably said that what's the most common theme in these people that are traumatized, would you say it's shame and guilt?
100%.
Right. 100%. So that is where that, that leads to that trauma. And what we know is that if someone goes through a traumatic experience, they will experience this, what we call this freeze response, which is a parasympathetic response, but it causes a massive release of cortisol, and that kind of crashes the right brain and disconnects the hemispheres and separates them from their body. And then it lives in the subconscious. And that you can't really access it consciously. And the left brain, most of left brain therapy, talk therapy, is really going towards the left brain and really can't access the right brain. So there's a movement in therapy to look at more right brain types of therapy, where how do you kind of access that, right? Freud talked about making the subconscious conscious, and he had different ways of doing that. But through music is brilliant, because really the language of the right brain is music. And when you write about these feelings and these emotions, or the trauma or the shame or the guilt, and putting it in a song makes it, and like you said, you're empathizing, and the empathy is really, again, a big right brain emotion. And that's kind of ultimately the healing in the right brain for shame and guilt and embarrassment and the fear 100%. Of rejection is. So you're basically not knowingly, what you're doing is, by having them write a song about it, accessing that right brain, healing that right brain, you're almost making the subconscious conscious, where they can now look at it from a conscious perspective and kind of step back because it's a song. And like you said, they may go and then actually sing it to their family and allow them to experience it in a way that they could not verbalize it with the left brain.
100%.
Yes,
we see it every time. The breaking down of the walls over the course of that 2 hours, it's a combination of the empathy, the shared empathy in the room. One person may have a really hard time sharing anything, and then the second person is really, really open. They start laying out their whole thing, and by the time you're getting into the song, the first guy will be like, well, yeah, when this happened to me, and it begins, one thing opens up another.
Sure.
And then the way we end it the next morning, as I always talk about, what happens when you share your story, is that it softens, it kind of gives a name to the monster under the bed that you're hiding, and makes it easier for you to deal with your stuff. And then it creates empathy with the other person who also feels like they're not the only one who's screwed up. So we really encourage people to share their story somehow creatively. So
yeah, that's what we were saying. Like with like last night with song, some people like Ellie's song about the rehab thing. People came up to her and said, "Wow, I hope you released that song because you really spoke to me, and there's a lot of people that would benefit." And that's what you do as songwriters. You're really you're speaking to people, and they're able to connect it to their emotions at a deep level, and they realize that I'm not the only one that thinks this way and feels this way.
Yeah, you were saying that it also like is as kind of heavy when you leave, because it feels good when you leave, but you're like taking on because you are such an empathetic right brain person, you're like taking on their emotions.
I have a little bit of a traditional thing. I go through this certain thing every time. I'll go in. I'm incredibly anxiety ridden going in with a blank space. I don't know if it's males or females. I don't know how many. I don't know what their background of service is. I just know that they deal with trauma. I don't know if they're going to be open and engaging, or if they're going to be super quiet. So little by little, I start relaxing as we get into the writing thing, and that opens up. And so, and they share, I mean, it makes sense. You talk about the shame thing. They're like, all of us walk in and our significant other goes, "How was your day at work?" And we're sharing, "Well, I had this really bad phone call with whatever." They're going, "I killed these 3 people because this was like," they're carrying these things that we can't even imagine, these visuals, from overseas, the things that they've dealt with. I can never open up to my wife or my husband the things I've done. They're just so dark. And so they can't fathom being able to shit. So you're right, they close them off, and they get in with these other folks who live in the same world, these brothers and sisters, and they begin to open up about these. And then by the next morning when we leave with the song, they're in tears and they're thanking me, and it's just the most amazing thing. And then I'll go leave, and I usually find a really, really good lunch spot somewhere. I'll go have an early cocktail, and I'll set my phone aside and just like, it's just a deep breath, and just kind of take it easy on myself to let some of that stuff just go away, and because it's we've gone to a couple movies, where I think that I'm cool. I don't, whatever. And I'm trying to remember the movie we saw recently. It's the movie. It's kind of it's real, very current day. I can't remember the name of it, but basically it's these photojournalists, and they're seeing all this stuff, basically happen with with a lockdown kind of situation, and very apocalyptical. But they're all photojournalists, and one of the retreats I did last year was with some embedded photojournalists instead of veterans. They're the people who are embedded with all the soldiers, and those rights were tough, because soldiers will go, "Well, let me tell you about what happened in Afghanistan." These photojournalists will start, "Well, let me just show you." So they pull out their MacBook and they're showing you all these pictures. Anyway, by the end of this movie, we were leaving, and Meg and I were in different cars, and I got in my car and I'm sitting in the garage at Green Hills, and I just start convulsively crying. And I just can't pull it together. And it's just not, I'm not really wired that way. And I'm like, and then I'm, 10 minutes later, I'm going, "What is that? What is this? What?" And it just suddenly hit me, like, you blow this stuff off like it's nothing, but I was suddenly reliving everything from this retreat and the stuff that they shared.
Yeah, that's very powerful.
It's intense.
Yeah, but I could see how for somebody like you, who also is, when you're using empathy and you become literally an empath.
Sure,
it's literally like you're taking on their trauma and their pain, and you have to do that to be able to write about it. Sure. I would imagine, right?
And I didn't realize that until we have our counselors on board with our organization, and they explain that, like, "Leah, you're taking all that on. You're literally receiving it, taking it, and you've got to figure out." Yeah, you can't. I mean, I do it with artists that I work with. I mean, I think I tell young artists that I work with all the time, if there's anything that I feel like I'm good at from a mentoring perspective, it's not about the victories I've had, the things I've done. I feel like I come more from things that I've done wrong, that I can help you maybe avoid some pitfalls. And but I think, you know, writing your own story, putting your own stuff in your songs, that's the only way to be an artist. And, you know, and it's yeah, you even sitting in a room, like I want an artist, if we're writing a song, I want you to feel a comfort level to lay on me whatever
Right.
is on your heart. And, you know,
That
and
can feel heavy too, because you're like, you're not only taking on everything that they're feeling, but then it's your job to put it out in a way that represents what they're feeling in a
right.
good, like you're like the facilitator of it. And it's like you have to put aside your own anxieties of like, I hope this is going to be good. I hope I'm going to, you know, but and then also take on what they're feeling. And like sometimes that alone is exhausting. Like I just the idea, like when I'm in a writer's room sometimes, just of like making someone else feel comfortable, and the anxiety that I give myself to hope that I make them feel comfortable. It's like a whole, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you
I
deal
think
with that as much, but
the way that I process that is that I'm here to serve you.
yeah.
You know, and so like if I'm writing with an artist and you're telling me I'm wanting to make a record and blah blah blah, this has been on my mind, da 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 da. At that point, it really is, the song is not about me. I want to bring whatever expertise I can bring to the room to help you get out what you want to say in a musical style you want to do it in. And it's really no different with the Soldiers. It's just the songs are, you know, typically more intense. And it's the recognition that, man, like, you know, somebody's life is in the balance. I mean, you know, and that's part of the heaviness of it. Like, you know, I would say there's been 4 or 5 of these that, you know, I would go in and inevitably one of the participants would share that, yeah, I mean, you know, 4 days ago I had a gun to my head before I came in here and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, because they're just living with all the stuff. It also, that makes the next morning that much more powerful, where they're, you know, it's like if I'm asking how are you doing, it's like, man, well, there's a light on now after going through this process that wasn't on last week, you know?
Well, the definition of empathy versus sympathy. Sympathy is where you can sympathize. Empathize is where you have to literally step into their shoes.
That's right.
You have to feel what they feel.
Yeah.
And that is, again, that's what the right brain does.
Yeah.
And so to feel that, it means that you have to feel that trauma and then to be able to write it as their story. That's what is going to make the song great. That's what's going to be very healing, but that's also got to be very taxing.
And what's great about this organization, I mean, like from early on, that was part of the thought process, part of what they teach us going into these writing sessions is, look, every now and then with your expertise as a songwriter, you may piece some little something together. But what you're there for is to take their words the best you can. You take their words, figure out ways to make them rhyme, find a melody, whatever. But it's really powerful at the end of the write when I thank them for writing with me, thank them for bringing their stories, and I've got a lyric sheet the next morning that I've printed out, and they're looking at the lyric sheet, and I'm going, these are your words. I didn't make this up. I facilitated you guys. This is your story, you know, and they know that they're the ones, and you can see it, man. Like we'll go, you know, I'll be playing the song, and you know that second line of the second verse that this guy shared something about whatever, and I'll sing that line, and you see this person just kind of lose it for a minute, you know, and that's an incredibly powerful thing, and I think that's what some of them do. Like they haven't figured out a way to share their story, but they can take this MP3 back, you know, and sit down with their family or whatever, and you know, maybe this will give you an idea of what I live with that I can't really talk about.
Sure. Well, again, the right brain doesn't have words. The right brain has feelings, but it does have music. And so, you know, again, that's why it's a brilliant solution to it, really. I can see how that, I think that would be great as something that more and more people would look at as a form of therapy. And you say, you know, over and over again in the article and over that you're not a therapist, you're not claiming to be a therapist, and there's great benefit to that. Obviously, people that are therapy and trained and to do that, but it might be a whole new way of approaching this that I really never heard of before, but I think is brilliant, really.
Well, I think it's, you know, you mentioned it earlier in a much more neurological way, but the way that your right brain, the way that you've been, you know, when you have these such intense shame or guilt-based things, how you just shut it off. You just can't communicate them. And part of the thought process, and I think what helps me in those rights is I've been there, you know, whether you call it repressed memories or whatever, anybody who's been through some trauma, you go through that. And I think we all know the power of ultimately being able to express that thing and get it out to someone. And so that's sort of how I feel about the songwriting sessions. It's like, and it's not just a soldier thing, same way with artists, whatever it is that you need to get out, there really is a healing aspect to suddenly beginning to be able to say, well, this happened to me, and you just name it. And again, that's the way I express it that next morning with those veterans before I leave. It's like, man, if you can figure out a way to tell your story, you're taking this thing that's hiding in your closet that you can't even address, and you're putting a name to it. And when you put a name to it, it just becomes less scary.
It's not scary
suddenly
anymore, yeah.
And then you love to grill, you love to cook meat. Well, you're grilling with a buddy over, and over the grill, your creative process, you somehow get into the subject of your story. And what happens is it begins to break down their fear, and you have someone who's a neighbor or a buddy going, man, I didn't know that happened to you. This happened to me. And then suddenly you really, really have this community healing kind of situation that takes place.
Right.
Just because someone's willing to open up a little bit.
Yep.
Yeah. And I'm with you. Music, that's what I've found more than anything else in those soldier things, man. Like music does that in ways that I don't think anything else does.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for doing that. That's amazing.
Yeah. So because you're such a badass, obviously, and you've overcome a lot in your life and been incredibly successful, especially after this episode, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more people that look up to you and relate to your story. And if you had like any advice that you wanted to give people that are maybe feeling the same way as you but haven't been bold enough to do it yet, what would you say?
Man, I think so frequently, like if I could talk to my 17 or 18-year-old self, letting go and laying down, outside perspectives or perceptions of what you should be or what you should, perform, write, create, whatever. Some of the greatest songwriters I've ever heard, start off advice with saying, write what you know. And I think, man, if you can dive into that, write what you know, follow your instincts of where your creativity has brought you. I did a whole lot of trying to fit in places that I thought I should try to fit in. Like, I grew up, the kind of music I grew up in was not hip, cool music. And so I would try to conform, not just like broaden my abilities, but I would try to do other things really almost out of a little bit of shame of the kind of music that I did. It's not cool. Like nobody wants to hear that kind of music. So I would try to do other things to fit in. And man, I think, your experience is what makes you unique. Your story is the only thing you can tell. That authentic story is the only thing you can share that's going to move people. I love your rehab thing. It doesn't matter if it's universal and everyone in the room goes, I love that song. What matters is maybe one person goes, that was life-changing to me. The whole night was fun. But when you share those authentic things, we talked about it a lot when we wrote Safe House. It's like,
you helped me so much through all that situation. So
I mean, I love you, and I think you're gifted, and I think you're a great human, and I've tried to be that way with any artist I work with. If I don't really like them, I don't want to waste my time at this point in my career. But I think the thing about it is, the most powerful thing is just your authenticity. Whatever your story is, whatever your theology is about your story, whether you feel like God has put you on this journey or the universe or fate or whatever, for some reason your journey has been your journey. And that's the most powerful story you can tell. Like that is going to affect everyone around you more than anything you can make up.
Yeah, just being authentic, even Absolutely. If it's scary.
Yes, scars and all.
Absolutely. That's a great message. Is really,
maybe that's what I'll call my record, Scars and All.
That's not bad. I kind of like that.
That's a good title.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. I wasn't talking much because I was just fascinated by everything you were saying.
I know, I'm blabbing too much. Sorry.
No, I was so
great.
happy everything you said. I was just like, wow, that was amazing.
I love what you guys are doing, because we can talk about the creative side of it all day long, but listening to you talk about the neurological side of it, there's a comfort level. After I listen to you talk about this stuff, I find myself going, oh, okay, there is a reason it feels the way it feels. There's a reason we react the way we react, where that makes that a little less scary to me. It's like, oh, I'm not so messed up. Like,
that's the point.
Yeah, it's just like what you were saying. It's like the song, putting it to words makes it, bringing the subconscious conscious. You can now heal it, and it's not so scary. When you look at it from a scientific perspective, from a brain perspective, from a neuroscience, and realize that, oh, okay, it's not your fault necessarily. This is the way your brain is wired at this point, and you can change that.
Sure.
But that there's a physical reason for it in manifestation. It also allows you to let go of some of the guilt and shame, and kind of look at it more objectively and stand back from a science perspective and say, okay, so this is how it all works. Yeah. And, even though you're feeling these emotions, it's just areas of your brain firing off. It's not real. None of it is real, right? Sure. It's the story that you tell in your head, and that becomes real. There's even something in our brain called reality testing, where, our right brain actually creates our reality and lets us know, is this real or not? So, it's another way of doing that. And that's what we're trying to do here, is bring out, the things that in the creative world that people struggle with, because, as we said, what makes you a great songwriter also leaves you vulnerable to things and emotions and to trauma and to pain. But some people find a way of being able to use that to not only heal themselves, but to heal other people. And that's what you've done your whole career. And now you're literally doing it with people that are traumatized. So it's amazing. Yeah. And that's what we wanted to do with this podcast.
Yeah, what you're doing, I think it's great. The reminder for us as creatives is, everything you write in your story, your authenticity, getting those songs out there, the reminder is that literally everyone else in the world is encountering some aspect of that. So the reason that these authentic stories, these authentic artists become so universal, or at least find a large audience, is because everyone out there is hurting from whatever it is they're dealing with, and they're gonna latch onto an artist who has found a way to say what they're feeling.
Yeah.
Right, Yep, speaks to them. So,
yeah.
100%.
Well, thank God for songwriters.
Yeah, and thank God for Danny Myrick.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here, Danny. You're the best, and this is amazing.
Awesome. I loved it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.